Do you remember sitting at a laminate kitchen table in the 1970s, staring baffled at a brightly colored wobbly dinner? Today, we are exploring 10 bizarre Australian meals every 70s kid consumed, but cannot possibly explain to modern children. Please give this video a friendly like and kindly subscribe to the channel. Apricot Chicken. Let's start with the undisputed heavyweight champion of 1970s suburban dinner parties, Apricot Chicken. Try explaining to a modern child that you boiled raw poultry in a sweet mixture of canned apricot nectar and powdered French onion soup. They will look at you like you have lost your mind. Yet this sticky, bright orange dish was an absolute revelation for busy mothers. The recipe was completely idiot-proof and pushed heavily by major soup corporations. You literally just dumped cheap chicken drumsticks into a heavy casserole dish, flooded them with the sweet, salty liquid, and baked it until the meat physically surrendered to the heat. The powdered onion soup created a thick, savory crust that somehow perfectly balanced the artificial sweetness of the canned fruit juice. It was always served over a massive bed of overcooked, plain white rice to soak up that glowing, tangy sauce. I personally think the sheer audacity of mixing dehydrated onions with cheap fruit juice is exactly what makes 70s cooking so brilliantly unhinged. When you brought this bubbling casserole to a neighborhood potluck, you were immediately considered a sophisticated, modern culinary genius. We ate it constantly, completely oblivious to how bizarre the flavor combination truly was. It was a sweet, savory masterpiece that defined an entire era of suburban Australian entertaining, leaving a permanent mark on our childhood memories. Porcupine Meatballs. What exactly do you do when you need to stretch a tiny, expensive portion of beef mince to feed a massive family? You invent porcupine meatballs. This was a brilliant, deceptive culinary trick that defined 1970s midweek dinners. The frugal recipe required you to mix raw, cheap white rice directly into raw minced meat before rolling it into dense balls. You then submerged these heavy meat spheres directly into a hot bath of canned, condensed tomato soup. As they simmered, the raw rice absorbed the salty tomato liquid, expanding and physically piercing through the outside of the meatball. The finished product resembled a red, spiked little porcupine. Trying to convince a kid today that eating a spiky, boiled meat sphere drowning in condensed soup is a delicious treat is entirely impossible. But to us, it was absolute culinary magic. The sharp texture of the rice protruding from the soft meat was fascinating to eat. It entirely masked the fact that we were eating mostly cheap starches instead of actual beef. It was resourceful, comforting, and filling on a freezing cold, rainy Tuesday night in the Australian suburbs. Every mum had her own slight variation, but the core foundation of rice, mince, and canned soup remained the undisputed rule. It was a brilliant lesson in household economics, masquerading as a fun, prickly dinner. Curried sausages. Have you ever attempted to explain the concept of boiling cheap beef sausages, slicing them into thick coins, and drowning them in a yellow, powdery curry sauce? Modern foodies recoil in horror at the mere mention of curried sausages, but in the 1970s, this was a culinary institution. The secret weapon driving this vibrant dish was Keen's curry powder, an earthy tin of spice that sat in every single Australian pantry. Mothers would fry cheap, processed sausages, chop them up, and simmer them in a thick, glossy sauce made of water, flour, and that famous yellow powder. To make things even more unhinged, they would often throw in a handful of sweet, wrinkled sultanas directly into the savory gravy. The textural contrast between processed meat, thick, floury curry sauce, and bursting sultanas is baffling to modern palates. You absolutely had to serve it over a mound of buttery mashed potato to soak up the stain it left on the plate. It was a cheap, potent meal that permanently stained your Tupperware containers a bright shade of yellow forever. No amount of scrubbing could ever remove that distinctive hue. We devoured it without question, enjoying the mild, unthreatening heat that introduced an entire generation to the very basic concept of international spices. It was an iconic weeknight staple that delivered cheap calories and a warming flavor that perfectly cut through the chill of a winter evening. Tuna Mornay. There was absolutely nothing that struck more terror into the heart of a 70s kid than hearing the metallic crank of a tin opener on a Friday night. It meant one specific, inescapable thing. Tuna Mornay was happening. This was a budget-friendly, oceanic casserole that relied on masking the strong flavor of cheap canned fish. The specific recipe required mixing flaky, pungent canned tuna into a thick, gluggy white cheese sauce. You then bulked it out by throwing in an entire can of sweet yellow corn kernels. But the absolute defining feature, the single piece of culinary genius that salvaged this fishy nightmare, was the crust. Mothers would crush up an entire bag of plain, salty potato chips and layer them over the top of the wet, cheesy slurry before baking it. The loud crunch of those salty chips hiding the soft mush underneath was absolute vintage brilliance. I remember carefully scraping off the potato chip crust and trying to leave the actual tuna behind. Trying to actively feed modern kids a hot, fishy, cheese-covered puddle topped with crushed junk food is a confusing, impossible task today. It simply belongs in the past, a true relic of an era when masking canned ingredients with heavy dairy was considered peak home cooking. We never asked where the fish came from. We just braced ourselves for the intense smell that would inevitably linger in the kitchen until Sunday morning. Chow mein. If you ordered chow mein in an authentic Asian restaurant today, you would be served a complex, wok-tossed noodle dish. However, the 1970s Australian suburban version was a confusing, unauthentic culinary fever dream. Vintage Australian chow mein incredibly contained zero traditional noodles and lacked any real Asian flavor profile. Instead, it was a heavy, dense brown mixture of cheap beef mince and shredded, boiling green cabbage. The secret ingredient that drove this bizarre cultural theft was the inclusion of a single packet of dehydrated salty chicken noodle soup mix. The tiny, brittle noodles from the soup packet were expected to substitute for actual fresh egg noodles. Mothers would simmer this salty, brown, cabbage-loaded mince mixture in a massive electric frying pan until the vegetables completely surrendered their will to live. You would eat it out of a bowl, confused about why it was called chow mein, but satisfied by the cheap beef flavor. Explaining to a thoroughly educated modern teenager that we pretended boiling dehydrated soup and cheap beef mince was an exotic international experience is humiliating today. We truly believed we were worldly and cultured while eating it. It was a fascinating glimpse into how isolated our culinary landscape was back then, relying on packet soups to mimic global flavors. Honestly, despite the massive historical inaccuracy of the name, the savory crunch of the cabbage mixed with the salty beef was actually quite delicious. Frankfurts and mash. Why exactly did an entire generation of Australians accept that feeding small children red, artificial, skinless meat tubes was a perfectly balanced weeknight dinner? The legendary combination of boiled cocktail frankfurts served over buttery mashed potatoes was a 1970s staple. The visual presentation was intensely jarring. Mothers would boil these small, bright red, processed pork and beef tubes until they swelled up and occasionally split open in the hot water. They were then dumped directly onto a soft cloud of whipped mashed potato. The absolute crowning glory of this cheap, artificial meal was flooding the entire plate with a thick pool of sweet tomato sauce. It was a colorful, salty, comforting culinary masterpiece. The snappy texture of the boiled frankfurt dipping into the soft, buttery potato was absolute perfection. Today, trying to convince a health-conscious parent to feed their child dyed, processed red meat tubes swimming in sugary sauce is a losing battle. It was a completely different, innocent culinary era, where nobody questioned what specifically gave the meat that radioactive red glow. We just blindly ate it, dipping each piece into the mashed potato volcano we built on our plates. It was fun, fast, and guaranteed an empty plate with zero arguments from the kids sitting at the table. To this day, the distinct smell of frankfurts boiling in a pot instantly transports me back to those carefree Friday nights. Rissoles and gravy. Step directly into any 1970s Australian kitchen on a raining Wednesday night, and you would be greeted by the heavy smell of frying onions. The classic Australian rissole was absolutely not a delicate, refined French meat patty. It was a dense, incredibly cheap, overcooked hockey puck of stretched beef mince. To combat the high price of meat, resourceful mothers would pack the raw mince full of stale breadcrumbs, grated carrots, and chunky raw onions. These dense meat discs were thrown into a hot, greased electric frying pan until the exterior formed a charred, dark crust. Often, the raw onions inside the dense patty would never cook, leaving a sharp, crunchy surprise hidden inside the meat. To hide the burnt exterior and dry interior, the entire plate was drowned in a dark, thick pool of powdered, salty gravy. Attempting to explain the joy of sawing through a tough meat puck disguised by artificial brown liquid to a modern kid is entirely impossible. It was suburban survival cooking at its finest, stretching a single dollar as far as humanly possible. The heavy gravy soaked into the breadcrumbs, creating a savory mush that paired flawlessly with frozen peas and corn. It was a humble, unpretentious meal that fed millions of hardworking families without requiring a trip to a fancy butcher. We loved those overcooked patties, Silverside and white sauce. There is a specific, pungent, entirely unforgettable smell that permeated suburban houses every single Sunday afternoon: boiling corned beef. The legendary Silverside and gluggy white sauce is a cornerstone of 1970s culinary trauma. You took a massive, pink, salted cut of incredibly tough cow muscle and submerged it in a giant pot of boiling water spiked with brown vinegar, cloves, and brown sugar. You then boiled the life out of it for several hours until the salty meat became stringy and slightly gray on the outside. The metallic smell of boiling cured meat is impossible to explain to someone who has never experienced it. To combat the salty, dry texture of the exhausted meat, mothers would construct a thick, heavy, floury white sauce speckled with chopped parsley. You smothered the pink slices of meat in this bland, thick paste. Presenting a modern child with a hot, salty, pink slab of boiled cow muscle swimming in floury white sludge is a guaranteed recipe for immediate tears. Yet, we consumed it every weekend without complaining. Any leftover meat was immediately destined for Monday's school lunchbox, thinly sliced and slapped between two pieces of buttered bread. It was the ultimate economical 2-for-1 meal that dominated the weekend dining table. It may not have looked like a gourmet feast, but the sharp vinegar tang of the meat combined with the creamy sauce was oddly satisfying. Devon and tomato sauce sandwiches. We must discuss the single most common, mysterious lunchbox staple of the entire decade: the legendary Devon and tomato sauce sandwich. Depending on which Australian state you lived in, this processed, smooth pink meat was known as Devon, Fritz, polony, or completely bizarrely, Windsor sausage. Nobody knew what specific animal parts were blended to create this uniform, rubbery pink lunch meat. We accepted it as a mysterious, manufactured protein cylinder. Mothers would slap a thick, cold slice of this sweaty pink meat directly between two soft, white slices of cheap supermarket bread. The mandatory requirement to elevate this cheap meal was squirting a thick layer of bright red, sweet tomato sauce over the pink meat. The acidic, sugary sauce perfectly masked the questionable, metallic flavor of the processed meat. Try opening a modern, health-focused school lunchbox and finding a sweaty, unidentifiable pink meat disc drowning in red sugar paste. The teacher would call your parents immediately. It was brilliant. Cheap 1970s childhood culinary perfection. On special occasions, you might even get a slice of plastic cheese added to the mix, creating a gourmet tier of lunchbox envy. We survived entirely on these highly processed sandwiches, trading them fiercely on the school asphalt under the hot midday sun. They were terrible for us, but absolutely nothing hit the spot quite like that cold, salty bite during recess. Golden syrup dumplings. Let's finish with a hot, sweet winter dessert that proves 1970s mothers were absolute culinary alchemists: golden syrup dumplings. When the cold winter rain slammed against the suburban windows, this cheap, sticky dessert was mandatory. The frugal recipe required creating a basic, heavy dough out of plain flour, butter, and a tiny splash of milk. You rolled this dense dough into small balls. But the magic happened in the boiling saucepan. Mothers would create a rich, dark, bubbling bath out of massive amounts of sticky golden syrup, butter, and water. You dropped the raw dough balls directly into this boiling sweet liquid. As they cooked, the dumplings absorbed the intensely rich, caramel-flavored syrup, puffing up into massive, soft, sticky golden sponges. You served them boiling hot, drowned in the sticky sauce, paired with a massive dollop of cold vanilla ice cream. Explaining to a modern kid that we boiled plain flour directly in hot sugar water to create a heavy, comforting dessert sounds insane, but it was an absolutely magnificent treat. The stark contrast between the scalding hot, chewy dough and the rapidly melting ice cream created a textural paradise. It was the ultimate economical indulgence that warmed our freezing houses and sent us straight to sleep. We would sit by the glowing orange bars of the radiator, scraping the very last drops of that liquid gold from the bottom of our ceramic bowls. These bizarre 1970s meals prove that our childhood dinners were deeply resourceful, unapologetically heavy, and utterly impossible to explain today. While we cannot feed modern kids boiled Frankfurts, those sticky memories remain. Which extinct 70s meal do you miss the most? Let me know in the comments, and please subscribe.